Unitarian Universalism is funny sometimes. Not funny haha, though we are that, but funny peculiar. We revere Pete Seeger, and we love that energy, that organizing, that community bond, right? What force on earth is weaker than the feeble strength of one? And yet, we are also a people who love and revere and have named untold religious exploration classrooms after people like Ralph Waldo Emerson, author of a work called Self-Reliance, with kernels of wisdom like the great man is he who in the midst of the crowd keeps with perfect sweetness the independence of solitude. We revere both the individual and the group. And sometimes we get into difficulty when we can't figure out which we are revering in a given moment. One of the strange ways that shows up in my life is that I am a minister. I work for a living here, with you, for you, with you. One of the two, both of them. And a funny thing that happens when you are a minister, especially in a denomination where there is not some man behind a curtain in a funny hat telling the church exactly how much they ought to pay their staff, including their ministers, which means that a weird thing happens on a somewhat regular basis, and it happens in this congregation and in all the UU congregations across the country, which is that the ministers negotiate with the congregation for how much they ought to be paid. It's really weird. And I think any of the lay leaders who have been involved in it would testify to its inherent awkwardness. To be in a position of wanting to advocate for yourself, needing to advocate for yourself as an employee, and yet also wanting the best for the group, for the congregation. Right? Knowing exactly how much money there is or is not. And I think that many of you, especially those who work in small nonprofits, are familiar with this strange dance. Right? Of trying to value yourself, trying to value the group, trying to figure out who wins and who loses on a given day, in a given year. And the end result is often that we come away feeling strange. And I think part of why we feel so strange is because we have a hard time talking about that tension between the reality that we honor the inherent worth and dignity of every person. We have that strain in our history where it's about one person taking a principled stance on something, about one person making something possible, about heroes in our history who through the power of their individual sense of self made something happen. And on the other hand, our deep practice of collectivism, our deep practice of community, of being together, of knowing that what affects one of us affects all of us, and we ought to go somewhere. If we're going to go, we ought to go there together. Like I said, that tension does not just exist in the minister and congregation employment relationship. It exists in lots of employment relationships. And that tension, right, one of the methods, one of the tools that we have sort of developed as humans to help resolve that tension, help us move through it, is unions, is labor unions. Right? A way that we get a sense of you're not just alone trying to advocate for what's right for you, you're part of a group. You get to do, right, collective bargaining, which basically means that you're going to work together to try to get what's fair. It's one of the ways we try to figure out how to navigate that tension. And this is not to say that unions are some sort of perfect solution. We're going to get to that in a few minutes, fear not. But we find this tension between our values and the way we try to move through society in lots of different ways, and Scott kind of talked about it in the context of congregational life, right? The tension between here's what I individually believe and how this place lets me do that, versus what are we doing together? What's our community about? What are we collectively about? What are we doing together? Which may or may not be totally in line with what I alone want or what I alone believe or the way I conceive of my identity as a Unitarian Universalist, as a member of the fellowship. But that the place we encounter it outside of these four walls, or for a very small number of us within these four walls, though I need to actually count the walls in here because there's definitely more than four, is in our employment relationships, in trying to navigate that, advocating for ourselves, but within a system that doesn't seem to actually want us to thrive. Back in the early 2000s, Elizabeth Kolbert wrote a piece for The New Yorker called "Why Work?" A valid question. And it was an exploration of Max Weber's work, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. Ooh. And that, for me, the takeaway from her article, which was about this sort of long, dense work about the relationship between Protestant churches and Protestant theology and ways of being in the world and capitalism, is that the ways that capitalism orders our lives are actually antithetical to our basic human needs. Our needs for connection, for love, for community, for a sense of purpose, not a sense of accomplishment, but purpose. And that the ways that sort of traditional work orders our lives, those things are actually at odds much of the time. Right? That we don't actually want a world ordered around the idea that there is a winner and a loser. That's actually, it's not just not in line with our values. It's actually not in line with just who we are as human beings. That if you look at the arc of human history, the idea that there have to be winners and losers, that if I get my way for what should be talked about more at the fellowship and you don't, right, that there's a winner and a loser. That if you get a raise, that means I can't. There's a winner and a loser. But of course, that universalist side of the family tree, that pesky universalist side of the family tree, asserts that there are no such things as winners and losers. Right? That even if you live a perfect life, a charmed life, if you are so good, you do everything right, that in the end, that's not as important as what is happening to all of us together. Right? It's that network of mutuality, that single garment of destiny. And what I appreciate about the lessons we can learn from unions, right? This one sort of way that human beings have tried to figure out how to solve that tension between our deep need for connection and group purpose and the knowledge that what happens to one of us affects us all, and the reality of the world we interface with on a regular basis, which declares winners and losers all the time. And in fact, there's whole political movements founded in the idea that you don't want to be a loser. Right? How much political rhetoric do we hear these days about how important it is to be a winner and not a loser? Yuck, I think is the technical term for my response. One of the important lessons that unions have as we seek to find a way to live into that common destiny rather than winners and losers is that unions invite us also, their history invites us to investigate our assumptions about what it means to act in some sort of collective best interest. About who is most often asked to knuckle under and give something up for the good of the group. Because how many of us have been in organizations, in family settings, in work settings, where again and again and again, the people who are invited to take one for the team, to work a little longer, work a little harder, not take the raise. When we think about who in a system, whether it's a family or a workplace or an organization, who is most often asked? I think many of you perhaps conjure images of women, of people of color, right? Of people who are already granted less authority and less power in the structure, that they are the people who are often asked to knuckle under the most. And that is true in the history of unions as well. Particularly, right, if you look at the history of trade and construction unions in large cities, and I spent far too much time this week going in depth on an expose by the Philadelphia Inquirer about the union that, its exact name is escaping me, but basically it's the union that works with all the people who operate heavy machinery on construction sites, cranes, front-end loaders, right, who operate those things, which is a very skilled job, and my gosh, I'm glad that we're vetting people before we let them operate a crane. All in favor. But that those trade unions, particularly in the trades and construction unions, were often used as a way to keep Black people, Latino people, people of color out of some of the highest paid, most stable construction gigs. That the union acted not as a way to ensure that all won, but as a way to ensure that certain people won. Which is not true of all unions and in all of labor organizing. And today, much of labor organizing that has a lot of active energy behind it seeks to widen the circle. But that we know that when we're trying to resolve that tension between the individual and the community, to find a way where people's individual needs are met and yet the group is going in a good direction, but there is always the danger that under the guise of doing it for the good of the cause, will actually repeat the very same structures we feel like we're trying to tear down. And you know, there's local history around knuckling under and the good of the order, right? The good of the group. There is a deep and wide labor organizing history here in Northeast Wisconsin, in part because of the paper industry and its centrality to the story of this part of Wisconsin. And it's funny, you know, I was reading some history about unions in this area. You know, Kimberly-Clark kept unions out of their factories for many years, decades even, longer than other employers did. And part of how they did that was that they had something called the Mill Council model. And the Mill Council model was basically a sort of a half union that existed internally at Kimberly-Clark, and that each of their plants, each of their mills, had a group of people who were charged with getting together to resolve conflicts between the owners and the workers. But a funny thing about the mill councils is that when the labor market favored the owners rather than the workers, suddenly the mill council stopped meeting. And then when labor got scarce, ooh, that mill council came back. Yes, we would love to hear about how we can retain you, because there's not very many of you. There were winners and losers. That if the owners were winning, then the workers were losing, or if the workers were winning, that meant the owners were losing. But part of being Unitarian Universalist is a commitment to the idea that it doesn't have to be this way, right? That whatever's happening in the world has not been ordained by some other higher power, right? Injustice is not something we are asked to deal with because it's good for us. It's something we're called to change because we know that what happens to any of us affects all of us. And so I wonder, this Labor Day and every day, goodness, what might become possible if we could break free from the idea that there are winners and losers? And I would say that most of us, if we were asked, you know, do you think in a cosmic sense that there are winners and losers and that someday some of us will go on to paradise and some of us will get the short end of the stick? We would say, no, we're universalists, everybody wins. But that's a lot harder to practice in our day-to-day lives, in relationship to the institutions we deal with on a daily basis, whether we are employees or employers, in government, in community organizations. It's a lot harder to move away from the idea that there are winners and losers and towards the idea that we might all thrive together. And so that's the question I hope you can take in your heart today. What's possible when we take that piece of what we think about, you know, sort of the grand scheme cosmic universe and actually apply it to our relationships, to our institutions, to how we are in relationship to each other? What becomes possible when we say that there are not winners and losers, that there's only us? What might become possible? May it be so. Amen.